During World War II, there were many different execution and torture methods deployed inside of the concentration camps. The SS and the guards of the camps were commanded and ordered to shoot and execute prisoners on the spot for different reasons, such as preventing escape attempts and insubordination. The inmates experienced terror and horror on a daily basis at the hands of men and women who were tasked to keep them down and deploy a reign of savagery. Guards patrolled with their whips and other weapons, such as pistols, and they did not think twice but to shoot at the inmates. Some guards even created their own torture devices, such as the Boger Swing, in which a victim was suspended high up in the air, and the victim was then battered by other guards and weapons. All of this activity, as well as the executions, resulted in the slaughter of millions of people in sites such as Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald. But what specific execution and torture methods were deployed inside of the camps? In this documentary, we will look at this. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The Einsatzgruppe were paramilitary death squads of the SS who followed the German army. They rounded up many civilians who had been left following the advances of the armed forces. Each Einsatzgruppe had many different firing squads, and it's believed that these forces shot more than 2 million people. The executioners forced victims to dig huge pits and graves on the edge of the settlements in their hometowns. They were then taken in small groups into these pits, where they were then shot by firing squads. Sometimes the firing squad was stood on the edge of the pit, but at other times there were executioners who patrolled the pits, and they ruthlessly executed their victims in cold blood. They would order the victims to lie down, often on the bodies of those who 10 minutes earlier went into the pit before them, and the executioner, the Einsatzgruppe soldier, then pulled out his pistol, then delivered a shot into the back of the neck, in the nape of the neck, that resulted in their instant execution. There were some rare accounts of victims surviving this being grazed by the bullet, but they then woke up and managed to survive, with the bodies of other victims on top of them. But this was usually the case when many people were shot on the edge of the pit, and the next shooting was said to have been more efficient, as the pistol of the executioner was pressed right into the neck of the victim. Genickschuss translates as neck shooting in German, and it was a method in which millions were executed. It was used inside the concentration camps as mentioned. There were special chambers found in camps such as Buchenwald, known as the Genickschussenlager. These were false medical facilities found inside of converted stable buildings, and they utilised deceit. They were made to look like doctors' rooms, and Soviet prisoners of war were marched into these rooms, and they were then told to prepare for a medical exam, and they entered the room, and they stood next to the height measuring device. But when they were stood there, a hatch behind them was then opened, and behind was stood an executioner with his pistol. The weapon was then pressed against the neck of the victim again, and the executioner shot into the nape of the neck. This was a method of execution in which thousands of prisoners of war were condemned by. Inside of Auschwitz, the deadliest concentration camp of the Second World War, there were many prisoners who were executed by shooting, and specifically neck shooting. It was usually 1 bullet per prisoner, and despite gassing being the most common method of extermination and death in the camp, when the crematoria and gas chambers struggled to cope with the sheer amount of people to be killed, neck shooting was used. Operation Hearst saw 430,000 people, in May 1944, brought to the camp to be slaughtered from Hungary, and this took place over 56 bloody days. It was said to have been too much for Auschwitz, and the crematoria could not cope with the bodies. But the gas chambers could not cope too, and mass pit executions took place, and victims were forced to undress, and they were then led to a hidden fire pit by members of the Sonderkommando, those prisoners of Auschwitz who were forced to clean up the deadly operations of the camp. The victims were then led into the pit where an SS executioner administered a gunshot to their neck, and the victims were then burned in the huge pits. Genickschuss or neck shooting was one of the most common execution methods used by the German forces of the Second World War. Tragically, it was more proficient and cheaper than utilising firing squads, who would stand opposite groups of victims, as if they missed, the German authorities saw this as a waste of a bullet. By utilising one executioner with a pistol, who could not miss, it was 1 bullet per victim, and millions of people were slaughtered in this method during the Second World War. It was certainly one of the most ruthless execution methods. Wilhelm Boger was a man who joined the Nazi Party early in 1929, and he then became a member of the auxiliary police before he moved to the political police based in Stuttgart. He attended various Nazi police training schools, and he then became a police commissioner, but as the Second World War broke out, he would be transferred to the state police-led office based in Zichenau. He set up and oversaw the creation of border police stations, but he would then find himself transferred to Auschwitz concentration camp. Inside the site, he first worked in the political department, and in this he was a representative of the Reich Security Main Office, and he was involved in keeping files on different prisoners, and also in keeping security tight within the Auschwitz site. Some other of Wilhelm Boger's responsibilities included the interrogation and torture of those who were suspected of being involved in resistance within Auschwitz, and he got his hands dirty when it came to torturing prisoners. For his crimes that he committed inside of Auschwitz, Wilhelm Boger became infamously known as the Tiger of Auschwitz, and in his role he developed different torture methods to inflict suffering onto the inmates. One of these contraptions was known as the Boger Swing, named after the SS guard who invented it. In this, a prisoner was strapped over a bar, and he was then suspended in the air, and the prisoner would then be battered by other guards until they gave over information regarding resistance inside of Auschwitz. Boger's secretary, after the war, later stated of this torture method that it was a metre-long iron bar, suspended by chains hung from the ceiling. A prisoner would be brought in for questioning, stripped naked and bent over the bar, wrists manacled to ankles. A guard at one side would shove him or her off across the chamber in a long, slow arc, while Boger would ask questions, at first quietly, then barking them out, and at the last bellowing. At each return, another guard, armed with a crowbar, would smash the victim across the buttocks. As the swinging went on, and the wailing victim fainted, they were only revived, only to faint howling again. The blows then continued, until only a mass of bleeding pulp hung before their eyes. Most perished from the ordeal, some sooner, some later. In the end, a sack of bones and flayed flesh and fat was swept along the shambles of that concrete floor to be dragged away. The prisoner could not get away. They were locked in this position for their ordeal. It inflicted terrible injuries, but Wilhelm Boger's crimes inside of Auschwitz continued until the camp was liberated. He was then arrested by the American military police, but he did manage to escape from custody, and he was then found working as a farm worker before he was brought to trial in 1963. He was a defendant in the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials and was charged with aiding and abetting the murder of prisoners. One man who testified about his actions claimed the 5-year-old child, clasping an apple in his hands, had jumped off the truck, filled with other boys and girls, en route to the gas chamber, the witness said. Boger grabbed the crying boy by his feet and hurled him against the nearest wall. Wilhelm Boger was sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labour for being involved in at least 114 cases of murder and accessory to murder in at least 1,000 cases. He did not really admit his crimes during this time, and inside of Auschwitz, the Boger Swing was his torture method that he developed to inflict a huge amount of suffering. This was a horrific ordeal for a prisoner to be subjected to, and it caused death and immense amounts of pain. The Boger Swing was one of the Second World War's most brutal torture methods. Flogging is referred to the punishment method in which someone beat another person with a whip or a rod, and this was mostly performed with the victim being hit across their back. It was used as punishment inside the military in some cases, as well as against those who were enslaved throughout history. It was used as punishment inside of the armies to prevent mutiny and also deal with it, and at times others were forced to witness this method being used, as it was seen as having deterrent value. During the Second World War it was performed upon prisoners who found themselves at the mercy of German officers and soldiers. Hitler issued the Commissar Order, in which all Soviet commissars were to be executed and shot. However, different commanders ordered different directives as to how prisoners of war should be punished, and how information should be extracted from them through different ways. One German commander of the 12th Infantry Division issued a directive stating, "The carrying of information is mostly done by youngsters in the ages of 11 to 14, and that, as the Russian is more afraid of the truncheon than of weapons, flogging is most advisable as a method for interrogation." With this, he was ordering his soldiers to interrogate captives using flogging, as they did not like it, and it was said to have been very painful. Flogging, of course, could result in death, as it was very dangerous at times, especially as a man armed with the whip could rain down dozens and dozens of blows. Inside of the concentration camps, this was very common punishment, and was carried out regularly upon those individuals who were locked up inside of them. It was common to see daily floggings inside the roll call yards, with prisoners being led up to the post where they were secured before the SS guard took the whip to them. Inside of Auschwitz, the largest and deadliest concentration camp of the Third Reich, flogging was used a lot, and was particularly common during evening roll call. A prisoner was brought up to a stool and was then placed on this, and they were then whipped and flogged, but then the SS guards innovated in the most brutal ways to punish people, and a special flogging contraption known as a goat was developed and used during flogging. The prisoner's feet were placed inside the wooden box, and then the prisoner was pushed over and would rest on the goat, and their arms were then stretched forward. The SS guard would then, with the prisoner locked in this position, begin the flogging process with a whip, a heavy stick, or some other object. With this punishment, the victim was forced to scream out the number of lashes in German, and if they lost count, then the punishment would begin all over again. The maximum amount of lashes which could be given was 25, and this was known to have been fatal, as someone could die from the injuries sustained, especially if they were beaten with a bullwhip or a heavy weapon. But some SS guards continued to rain down blow after blow onto the prisoners, and they had little regard for this. Flogging was also done inside of the torture and punishment block of Block 11, a brick-built building inside of Auschwitz I, which was synonymous with the brutal treatment of prisoners who were interrogated terribly. Inside Block 11, other methods such as the standing cells were used, but flogging was used by some guards as light punishment, but it could of course be fatal. Inside other camps such as Dachau, commandants wrote the rules on punishment, and they outlined the use of flogging in this. But it was a torture and punishment method used throughout the Second World War and inside the concentration camps, and of course this was a method that had a long history, but its use in the Second World War is linked to the further suffering of many people inside the harshest places inside the Third Reich. Inside of Treblinka, there were 3 different regions of the camp, with the aim of this site and intention of it to exterminate as many people as possible. Victims arrived inside of the reception area before they were then sent to their deaths, being forced to run through what was known as a tube. This was a fenced-in path which led to the gas chambers where guards drove prisoners with no way out. The gas chambers were fitted with a diesel engine that pumped in carbon monoxide, which killed hundreds of thousands. After this was done, the Sonderkommando prisoners then collected the bodies for them to be burned inside of the ovens in the open air. But for those who were not able to walk to the gas chambers, such as the elderly, they were executed often inside the lazarette. This translates as infirmary in German, and it was made to look as if it was a medical facility or a small hospital. It was decorated with red crosses, and people believed that they were getting some medical treatment when they were taken there. But the only people waiting for them were executioners armed with their weapons, pistols and rifles. These victims were shot in the lazarette to ensure that the killing process did not slow down, and there were special executioners who worked here, such as August Meiter. He was known as the Angel of Death of Treblinka, and he later stated at his trial regarding the lazarette that there were always sick and crippled people in the transports. There were also those who had been shot and wounded en route by the SS, policemen or others who guarded the transports. These ill, crippled and wounded passengers were brought to the lazarette by a special group of workers. Inside the lazarette, they placed or lay these people at the edge of the pit. When all the sick and wounded had been brought, it was my job to shoot them. I fired at the nape of the neck with a 9mm pistol. Those shot would fall into the pit. The number of people shot in this way from each transport varied, sometimes 2 or 3, sometimes 20 or even more. They included men, women, young and old, and also children. The lazarette featured a large pit where bodies were burned, but the victims were sat on the edge of the pit, where an executioner approached them from behind and then executed them. A former prisoner of the camp said of the execution zone that a German with a machine gun is waiting, and with one burst puts them all out of their misery. They fall into a huge fire-filled ditch that occupies most of the area. Two of Kurland, Akapo's helpers, tried to arrange the piles of corpses so they burned quickly and completely, in order to make room for the new victims that keep streaming in. It was ruthless, and every day there were many people being brought for their executions. Another guard who worked there was Willy Mentz, the gunman of Treblinka, who stated that in the region of the lazarette there were mass graves, and those who were shot were also laid on the edge of the pit, or grave, where they were shot. Mentz admitted that he shot these victims with his own pistol, and that following this their bodies were covered in lime and were then quickly burned. He also admitted that when prisoners arrived at the site, that there were often as many as 20 people who Mentz shot with his pistol. Another former prisoner claimed of the killing process in the lazarette that, ahead of me a bored sentry sat on a little chair clutching a rifle. Before him down below was a deep pit. At its bottom were heaps of corpses which had not yet been consumed by a fire burning under them. I stopped in my tracks, paralysed with terror. The sizzling half-burnt cadavers emitted grinding and crackling sounds. The flames, once having enveloped them, either dissipated into little jets of smoke or reignited into a blaze which forced firewood and corpses into the devil's embrace. Here and there I could make out the torsos of men and women or little children. The smell of burning flesh reached my nose and prompted a flow of tears. Just then the old men began toddling up the bank, 3 or 4 metres high, in front of me. Stepping hesitantly, they suddenly caught sight of the pit and its contents. Aware that they had stepped into a trap, the miserable souls tried to escape as best as their exhausted condition permitted. As they scattered across the little platform, however, the guard pumped bullets into their heads and shoved them into the pit. The point of the lazarette inside of Treblinka was to ensure that those who could not walk through the tube to the gas chambers could be executed in secret away from this part of the camp, to make sure that the slaughter was not slowed down. It was a ruthless execution method, as people believed they were getting some form of medical care, but they would be then led out towards a pit where they were slaughtered by gunshot. Thousands died in this area of Treblinka, and it added to the horror and evil of the camp. Sachsenhausen concentration camp was a camp where death lurked around every single corner. There were 200,000 prisoners that passed through the site's barbed wire fences, and over 50,000 people were killed in it. This even included the oldest son of Joseph Stalin, Yakov Zhugashvili, who walked into the electric fence around the camp, and he was then shot by a German guard. It was a ruthless camp where inmates were forced to work incredibly hard, and they were given poor food rations, and the inmates were subjected to violence and beatings at the hands of the guards. The prisoners had very poor living conditions, and there were executions carried out in public at times, and the SS Guards, even in 1942, created Station Z, a purpose-built execution unit just outside the camp's walls on an industrial unit, and this contained a number of execution chambers where prisoners could be shot or hanged as well as tortured, and there were also 4 crematoria for burning the bodies, and also a sand pit, which was used as an execution trench where firing squads regularly shot into their victims. Torture at Sachsenhausen was very common. The prisoners were often forced to conduct excruciating long punishing days of exercise, and found at the camp was a marching strip around the perimeter of the roll call yard, and here inmates were forced to march over a variety of different terrains to test military footwear, which would then be sent to the German soldiers if they were any good. The inmates were often forced to cover up to 25 miles a day. They were given hardly any food, and many died from exhaustion because of this, and the guards whipped and beat them to walk quicker and faster. Some of the prisoners were even given performance-enhancing drugs to then trial the boots which were being made for the army. Many prisoners were also kept in isolation and in prison, and the guards even utilised medieval-style torture methods such as the scripado, where prisoners were hanged in the air from their wrists, which were secured behind their backs. But one of the torture methods used upon the prisoners was exclusive to Sachsenhausen, and it involved physical exercise, and it was known as the Sachsenhausen salute. The guards of the camp came up with this, and they wanted to inflict the most amount of physical pain as possible. The salute was where an inmate was forced to assume a position where they had to squat with their arms stretched out in front of them. The salute was where a prisoner was forced to assume a position where they had to squat with their arms stretched out in front of them. They could be forced to remain in this position for hours on end, and if they fell over or stood up due to the pain on their limbs and muscles, then they would be beaten by the guards and battered. Sometimes the guards would even place weights on the inmates whilst performing the salute, which put even more strain and pain on the muscles. It was excruciating, and some inmates could be forced to walk around the camp in this position if they could move. The Sachsenhausen salute was a simple and straightforward torture method, which was performed in public to make the life of inmates painful. It was common to see groups of prisoners around the roll call yards being forced into this position for some time, squatting with their arms stretched out, and it was a ruthless torture method that inflicted strain and pain unnecessarily. It helped many of the guards to gain a reputation for being brutal overseers, and it was a simple torture method that did not require any other torture or instruments. It just needed overseers who were ardent in forcing prisoners into the position, and who would punish those if they moved from it. Mauthausen concentration camp opened on the 9th of August 1938, and the first inmates of the site had been sent from the first concentration camp of Dachau, which was set up inside of Nazi Germany. These inmates were forced to construct much of the new site, which would be later used for slave labour, and after much research by the SS officials, they settled on the construction of Mauthausen, being where it was, due to the close proximity it had to a granite quarry. The camp was created around this, and also there were good transport links, as it was found close to Linz, the hometown of Adolf Hitler. The granite that was mined inside of Mauthausen previously was known to have been very good quality, and it was even used to pave the streets of the Austrian capital, Vienna. Adolf Hitler and the Nazis planned to construct a new Germany and a new capital, and the plans were huge in their scope, and for this Hitler needed a huge amount of granite. He did not want to spend huge amounts of money on resources, building new buildings and construction projects when he had one eye on a new global conflict. Hitler preferred to spend more of the German money on the military and improving armaments production, and because of this the solution was to use prisoners of war and slave labour to work inside of Mauthausen to mine the resources that were needed. Mauthausen became one of the largest complexes inside of the concentration camps, and some of the subcamps were huge. But there were many other factories constructed around Mauthausen, and many other companies used the prisoners to work inside their factories for free or very little, which would then be paid to the German Reich. The conditions of Mauthausen were terrible, and there was a huge issue with overcrowding, and the barracks that the prisoners lived and slept in were not sufficient for the amount of people inside of them, and because of this there were many diseases which spread around the camp. One of the biggest issues with Mauthausen was that accidents and incidents from work were very common, and there was a medical facility established in the site, which was known as a Krankenlager. But there was no medicine given to prisoners, just very basic first aid, and a number of experiments took place inside the camp, and the average life expectancy of the inmates was roughly 6 months from when they arrived inside of Mauthausen, and as the war rolled on and continued, the life expectancy just became 3 months. As the war turned against the Germans, the food rations inside of Mauthausen got even more stretched, and they decreased, and prisoners were too weak to stand, and those who could not work were sent to extermination sites, such as the nearby Hartheim Castle, where they were forced into gas chambers, when they believed they would be given some form of care and medical treatment. But one of the most ruthless and horrific elements of Mauthausen, which was certainly one of the most striking, was the Stairs of Death. This was a huge set of stairs, which led towards a quarry, where much of the granite was being mined, and then taken to the main camp. The stairs were 186 specific stone steps, which were all uneven, and some were very large, requiring a prisoner to clamber up them, and the inmates were forced to carry heavy stones, weighing up to 50 kilograms, up and over the stairs many times a day from the quarry. It was harrowing work, and this was made worse as the guards drove the inmates up quicker, beating them and striking them with their whips and other weapons. This usually led to accidents also, and if a prisoner in a queue of prisoners up the stairs fell, then they could cause a domino effect of dozens of people then falling down the stairs, which was very dangerous. They were forced to carry these boulders all day, and this was exhausting work, and was some of the most severe labour used inside of all the concentration camps. But there were many different ways in which prisoners were executed by the guards, and the SS officials and guards, for example, even forced some prisoners to walk into the electrified fences around camps such as Auschwitz. At Mauthausen, the guards used the quarry and the Stairs of Death to execute prisoners and inmates. They played a horrific game, which was known as the parachutist's wall, or the Fallschirmspringerwand. The guards led a collection of prisoners up to the edge of the quarry pit, above the stairs of death, and they then at gunpoint ordered them to stand in a line, with one poor soul stood on the edge of the cliff. These prisoners were then told that they would participate in a sick game, and they were then told they had the option of pushing the prisoner in front of them off the cliff, or if they failed to do this, then they would be shot on the spot. It was referred to as the parachutist's wall in a very sick way, as throughout the day the prisoners would be thrown off the cliff face to their deaths. And of course there was absolutely no chance of survival, as the inmates crashed into the stone quarry below them from a huge drop. The fact they were either forced to take the life of another inmate and prisoner, or they would be shot, was a harrowing choice, and some did face the bullet of the SS executioner there and then for their refusal to push, but others, under immense duress and the threat of their own lives, did do this and pushed other people off the cliff. It was kill or be killed, and the prisoners did not have a choice to do this, or leap off the cliffs themselves. A former prisoner claimed about the work inside of Mauthausen's quarry that, if you stopped for a single moment, the SS either shot you or pushed you off the cliff to your death, and the decision to take part in the parachutist's wall or not was one which prisoners had to very quickly make. There were many guards who worked at Mauthausen who became known for their brutality, but only a select few were sent to their deaths inside of the execution chambers of the Allied prisons for their actions. Many SS guards managed to escape, and the parachutist's wall was a horrific and terrifying game that the SS played. They would throw dozens of prisoners off the high cliffs to their deaths. Mauthausen was known for its death toll, and over 90,000 people succumbed to the horror of the sight, with extermination through labour policies leading to the life expectancy of just a matter of months from when an inmate entered Mauthausen for the first time. The stairs of death and the quarries was where a horrific amount of terror was inflicted upon very vulnerable people, and whilst many were hard at work in the quarries, it was known to see people plunging from the cliffs to their deaths, being driven by the SS. There was a huge number of torture methods used inside of Auschwitz, and some of these were inspired by the medieval period. Within the torture block of Block 11, there were a number of standing cells in the dungeons. These were tiny cells in which a prisoner could not sit down or crouch. They were forced to stand for days on end, which was harrowing, and they were starved. One prisoner was so desperate that he even ate his own shoes inside of the Sterbunker, or the standing cells. But these were inspired by medieval oubliettes, dungeons found within castles, where prisoners were simply forgotten. Used inside of Auschwitz and other concentration camps was a form of medieval torture, which was made infamous during the Spanish Inquisition, and this was a variation of the strapado. This was a structure in which a victim was suspended from their arms, which had been tied behind their backs, and this caused immense pain and suffering, and it was often enough for someone to submit to what their torturers wanted. This was used inside of Auschwitz and was known as the post. Punishment by post was frequently used within the deadliest concentration camp, and to begin with, it was initially carried out inside the main Auschwitz site of Auschwitz I. The prisoners were hung from hooks on high posts, and they had their hands tied behind their backs with a rope or chain that was then held at a height which made it impossible for a prisoner to touch the ground with their feet. They were hoisted up in the same way as the strapado, and with their arms behind their backs, it caused immense pain and brutal pain. The intense suffering caused by the twisting of the shoulders often led to victims to pass out, and their muscles and ligaments in their shoulders were often torn by the punishment, and their shoulders could also dislocate during the ordeal. What was also shocking was that the torture method of the post had a more dangerous effect than just the physical pain inflicted on the sufferer. If a prisoner of Auschwitz was said to have been too ill or weak to work, or they were injured, they would be selected to be sent to the gas chambers, and because of this, those prisoners who were damaged by their ordeals on the post were then sent to the gas chambers, where they were exterminated. This added to the death toll of Auschwitz, but ordeals on the post could last for 1 hour, and in some cases there were people who were suspended by their shoulders for many hours on end, and this punishment was repeated. If they gave over information to their captors, they would be spared any more punishment, but this was also performed inside of Block 11, and also in public, in a similar way as flogging. The post of Auschwitz did travel in its use, as inside different concentration camps, there were other guards who utilised similar style punishment. Within the forests of Buchenwald concentration camp, there was a brutal guard known as the Hangman of Buchenwald, who suspended prisoners from their arms high up in the trees, and he was so barbaric that this guard was even sacked because of his terrifying actions that he was responsible for. This guard was said to have been even too much for the SS. But the post of Auschwitz at the end of the war, when the site was liberated, was shown to the Soviet liberators, and there is footage of a group of prisoners showing their liberators the torture posts and how these were used. It was certainly one of the most painful and dangerous torture methods deployed within Auschwitz concentration camp. Within the deadliest site of the Third Reich, Auschwitz, there was a punishment and torture centre known as Block 11, where many horrors were carried out. In the basement of this building was standing cells, known as the Sperrbunker, which were tiny prisons where a prisoner could only stand and could not sit down, and they were held locked up in these cells for days on end. There were men such as Wilhelm Boger, who came up with his own method of torture and pain, such as the Boger Swing, in which a victim was strapped to an iron bar and was then literally battered by other guards until they gave over information or were killed. But through these different sadistic innovations to inflict so much suffering as possible, a number of guards developed another method of causing pain, which was known as the goat. This took one of the most common punishment methods and made it much more severe. Welcome to the Fortress. Today we look at the Auschwitz goat, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. One of the most public punishments used inside of Auschwitz was flogging. This was where a victim was beaten with a whip or a rod or other weapon, and usually someone was struck across their back. It is a punishment that dates back centuries, but inside of Auschwitz flogging was so brutal that it could result in death. Usually the camp authorities declared that the maximum amount of lashes that could be given was 25 strikes at one point, but some sadistic guards went further, inflicting many more. This was known to have been fatal, and some prisoners died from their pain as they were secured to the whipping post, and other guards chose to use heavier weapons, which inflicted even more pain. Inside of Auschwitz, flogging was administered, as mentioned, on flogging posts or whipping posts, and also on stools as prisoners were forced to sit down, often in front of many other inmates, and they were then struck many different times. But other SS guards innovated in one of the most sadistic ways possible, and they considered how to make flogging more brutal and severe, and what they came up with was known as the Auschwitz goat. This was a simple change to flogging, and it was also used in different concentration camps all inside the Third Reich. The Auschwitz goat was simple. It was a box in which the prisoner's feet were secured and locked inside of. They were then pushed over resting on the goat. This was a wooden table which was curved at each side, and the prisoner and victim was then forced forward onto the table. Their arms were pulled forward, stretching them slightly. With the victim locked in this position, the guard then using a whip, heavy stick or other object, then rained down blow after blow onto the inmate, who was forced to scream out the numbers of the lashes in German. If they lost count, then the whipping would begin all over again, and some guards ramped up the force of the whip with every hit and strike. The goat was also used as punishment in the yard near to Block 11, the previously mentioned torture block, and it could be moved around the site when it was needed. What is sadistic about the Auschwitz goat is that the guards inside the deadliest concentration camp decided to make a more sadistic and brutal punishment method to make the lives of prisoners much more difficult. The victim was left exposed on the goat, making their punishment more brutal and ruthless, and when done in public, it had a profound effect on the other prisoners, as they saw the suffering that it caused. It was more likely to make a prisoner fall into line, seeing this sort of action. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.